Good morning. Welcome to the Community Leaders Briefing with the City of Torrance and California State Senator Ben Allen. My name is Russ LaFave, and I'm the Torrance Director on the Metropolitan Water District Board. Thank you for being here today and participating in our community dialogue on water and the environment in the South Bay. The water challenges facing the state of California and region involve many complex issues that require thoughtful collaboration by our elected officials, our water industry professionals, and each and every one of us today. So I want to point out that you are all really very fortunate today. You're going to hear from three of the most influential leaders on water issues in the state. Under the direction of Governor Newsom, the California Natural Resource Agency and the Department of Water Resources, we've started the process of developing a California water resilience portfolio that will recommend actions for developing a climate-resilient water system and ensuring healthy waterways for 27 million California residents. The portfolio has 133 recommended actions. In addition, the California Department of Water Resources has become a new process to address the decade-old Delta environmental and regulatory matters for the governor's new single-tunnel Delta conveyance project. In 2019, Governor Newsom and our legislature took historic steps to provide funding and a long-term solution for communities that do not have access to safe drinking water throughout the state. And locally, we're working together to develop more local supplies by reusing water in Carson that is currently sent to the ocean and planning on capturing stormwater. And we are expanding conservation programs to make it easier for residents and businesses to save water. I want to point out that we are facing, even as we are here today, a difficulty with water for the state. January and February were really dry months. The city of Sacramento hasn't gotten by without rain in February since 1864, President being Abraham Lincoln. And the Sierra watershed is less than 50% of normal for this date. However, and I'm sure Jeff will talk about this, the service area of the Metropolitan Water District is going to be okay. We have stored almost 4 million acre-feet of water, and no matter what happens in the future for this year, we'll be able to use some portion of that water to get us through any dry year. So these are just a few examples of the need for leadership and collaboration in addressing our state's water challenges, and we'll learn about more in our dialogue this morning. So we'll soon hear from Senator Allen and Metropolitan's General Manager, Jeff Keitlinger, about the water and legislative issues impacting the state of California and our communities. But first, please join me in welcoming fellow Metropolitan Water District Director Harold Williams, who represents the West Basin Municipal Water District. My friend Harold Williams is a California registered civil engineer by profession, a career he has held for over 40 years. Again, please welcome Director Williams, who will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
All right. Thank you, Director LaFave, for that very nice introduction. But before I do that, let me just say this. I greet you all in the spirit of water reliability and in the spirit of water sustainability. How does that sound? With that, please join me in the pledge to our flag. Please repeat after me. or repeat with me, should I say. Thank you. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may be seated. Thank you.
So, you may be seated. Thank you, Director Williams. Today we're honored to have several local officials with us, and I'd like to take a few moments to recognize them. And please hold your applause until the end. First, I'd like to note that Senator Ben Allen is here. Aurelia Friedman, who represents Ted Lieu. George Chen, a Torrance City Councilman. Nancy Hersman, who's the mayor of the city of Manhattan Beach. John Cruikshank, mayor of the city of Rancho Palos Verdes. Henry Sanchez Jr., council member from the city of Lomita. Hildy Stern, council member from the city of Manhattan Beach. And one of my favorites, Gloria Gray, chairwoman of the Metropolitan Water District. You've already met Harold Williams, but if he wants to stand again, he can. And I have Rob Catherman, who's director in the Water Replenishment District, and Jeremy Gerson, school board member for the Torrance Unified School District. Now, I guess I should point out this is not a perfect approach here. Are there any electeds that I have managed to miss somehow? Okay, I guess not. Thank you all. At this time, I'm pleased to introduce Jeff Keitlinger, the General Manager of the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. Metropolitan is the nation's largest water wholesaler, delivering water to our 26 member agencies, who collectively and in partnership with our local water retailers serves over 19 million people throughout the 6-county, 5,200 square mile service area. Jeff leads a diverse and talented workforce and ensures that the director fulfills its mission to provide reliable supplies of high-quality water in an environmentally and economically responsible way. Before becoming general manager in 2006, Jeff was general counsel for the district. Before joining Metropolitan in 1995, he was in private practice as one of the leading environmental lawyers in the region. Today, Jeff, in his copious free time, serves on several boards, including the Coral Foundation, the USC Price School of Public Policy, the UCLA Sustainability Advisory Board, the Climate Action Reserve, the California Foundation on the Environment and the Economy, the Los Angeles Economic Development Council, and the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce. I guess I could go on, among many others. I would like to just point out that Jeff is just a terrific leader. He has served to lead the Metropolitan Water District through the driest year on record and the wettest year on record. The challenges are really quite different, and Jeff has led the Met staff to develop some really innovative methodologies that we think will take us through any foreseeable water scenario that you can think of. And with that, please join me in welcoming Jeff Keitlinger, General Manager for the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. And with that,
well, thank you very much, Russ. Good morning. Welcome. Hope you all enjoyed your lunch. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Metropolitan, what it is we do, and and give you a sense of what we see coming and some of the challenges we have. And I'll keep it brief because I know we want to hear from the state senator and from our chairwoman, Gloria Gray. So, Southern California is a pretty unique spot, and we don't simply have the rainfall and the natural water supply to support this many people. It's pretty amazing. Metropolitan serves water to 6 counties: Ventura, Los Angeles, Orange, Riverside, San Bernardino, and San Diego County. That's 5,000 square miles located here in Southern California. It's about 1/20th of the state, and we have half the people. 1 out of every 2 Californians lives here in Southern California. It's 1 out of every 17 Americans, actually. And we are about 60% of the state's economy down here, which is the 5th largest economy in the world. So it's pretty amazing. We've packed a lot of people in here, and we have an incredibly productive area without a lot of natural water. And they knew that. They knew it from the beginning, from the 1900s, and they realized they had to pool resources to go build massive systems. And where does our water come from? We get about 1/3 of it from our groundwater basins and locally, and the rest comes from a number of other sources, but the 2 biggest blocks of water come from the Colorado River. Metropolitan built the aqueduct in the 1930s, and we connected to the Colorado River in the Great Depression, and then from Northern California, from the Sierras through the State Water Project, the project that we built with Governor Pat Brown in the 1960s. Those 2 blocks of water are about little more than half of all the drinking water in Southern California, and that's Met's job to deliver it. Now, we talked a little bit about our hydrology, which we always talk in our business about average years and normal years. The reality is we don't have average or normal years. We have 7 years of dry, and then we have 3 years of wet, and then we draw a line. But the reality is it goes like this, and we draw a line and say, here's average. And so our mission is to basically take these wet years, capture it, and smooth out the valleys, smooth it all out so we have water every single day. And so what we do is we capture the water in these big wet years. 2018, wettest year in recorded history. 2015, they think it was the driest year for 1,500 years looking at tree rings. It's the driest year in recorded history. We think it was the driest year California experienced in over 1,500 years. Those were with just a couple years apart. We've always had a volatile weather cycle here, but with climate change, it's gotten much more dramatic, and that's going to continue. And we're going to have to build and prepare for that, and that's part of our mission. We didn't used to have much water storage in Southern California. By 1990, we actually rationed water for the first time in Southern California, and it was a big wake-up call. And Metropolitan started building and investing in storage. A typical year for us, and we measure water in acre feet, which is basically a football field with a foot of water on it. A typical household uses about 1/3 of an acre foot for an entire year. So we typically sell about 1.7, 1.8 million acre feet of water a year. In 1990, Metropolitan had storage for about 300,000 to 400,000 acre feet. So if you're selling 1.8, 1.9 million acre feet a year, and you can only store total 400,000 acre feet, you get a sense. You basically have 3 months of storage, and that's about it. Now we have the ability to store 5 million acre feet. Coming out of the worst drought California recorded history, we currently have more than 4 million acre feet of water in storage. We really know how to prepare and manage through these dry cycles. The period we had, Jerry Brown declared emergency, it was as dry as they had in Cape Town, where they had day 0 where they didn't have any water, and actually you had to get water by buckets. It was as dry as Australia experienced when they had their millennial drought, and they had to completely tear up their water system and build emergency $15 billion worth of emergency ocean desal without any permitting because they just declared a state of emergency. We didn't see any of that in Southern California, but that's mainly because we've been preparing for this, because we know we have to. This is what we have. When you have a state of 40 million people, you have to be prepared, and you have to manage, and you have to build for it. Now, we're not going to be importing more water in the future, and we are continuing to grow. And so where is that water going to come from? Well, we've changed how we think about it. We're not building those big aqueducts anymore. Instead, we're recycling water. Southern California recycles 10% of its water. That is by far and away the most anywhere in the United States. Other parts of the United States are 1% to 2%. But we know we can do a lot more. If you go to places like Israel, they recycle 70% of their water. You go to Spain, they recycle over 20%. So we know we can do more. One of the exciting projects we have right here coming up in Southern California, in your nearby neighborhood in the city of Carson, is a regional recycled water project Metropolitan's doing in partnership with the Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts. As we work through this project and do the environmental review, it's going to be eventually the largest water recycling plant in the nation. What that will do, all our groundwater basins that currently get replenished with imported water that Metropolitan brings in from Northern California, we're going to actually switch over replenishing all our groundwater basins with recycled water coming out of the Carson plant. Working closely with the City of LA, they are looking at doing the same thing at their Hyperion plant. City of San Diego's also looking at doing their pure water project with their Point Loma outfall. So you see Southern California is really stressing the need to get ahead of the curve on climate change and be prepared for the future and be reliable. And that's our mission. That's what we have to do. The last bit of good news on that is we're ahead of the curve and we're doing all that. The hard news is all these things take money. They take effort. They take a lot of work. I know a number of you folks seen probably our projects down here. Our systems were all built in the 1940s and 1960s, so they're getting old. We are tearing up a number of streets, replacing concrete pipe with steel liners. We've been working our way through Long Beach. We're working our way through Rolling Hills Estates. I know we've done some work in Palos Verdes. So we have a lot of projects that you'll see where we're replacing that old infrastructure. And that's part of what living here means. We're starting to become an older, settled neighborhood. We're not quite the East Coast yet, but we're having to do a lot of that work in infrastructure repair. But the good news is, it is happening, it is going forward, and we're working with all of you to do that, and we appreciate all that support. So with that, I think there may be questions at the end, but I just wanted to leave you with that we're now have another dry year. This year looks like a drought year. We have the driest February we've seen, where the city of Sacramento, Director LaFave brought it up, is actually going to get zero rain for the entire month of February. It hasn't happened since 1864. So, but you're not really going to notice it. We're prepared for that, and that's the important thing. So with that, I'll leave it, and I believe our next coming up is our chairwoman, or we have an MC. So Director LaFave, you're going to MC this matter. Okay, thank you. All right, thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeff. That was a lot of information in a short time. So I would now ask you to join me in welcoming Metropolitan Water District's Chairwoman Gloria Gray, who represents the West Basin Municipal Water District, to the stage. And as Gloria is coming up, I'd like to just note that she has been serving as a chairwoman for difficult water problems, and she has just done a remarkable job, maybe not remarkable, just an outstanding job in dealing with some very, very difficult water problems. So in 2019, Chairwoman Gray became the first African American elected by her peers to lead the Metropolitan Water District's Board of Directors, and only the second woman to do so in the district's 90-year-old history. Gloria, your turn.
Thank you, darling. Thank you so much. Thank you, Russ. Thank you for the introduction. Gee, I am so excited to be here today because when I walked in the room, and usually when I go places, I know folks, but when I looked around the room, I saw many faces that I had met before, and it's always such a delight to kind of reconnect. And so I want to say greetings in terms of some of the folks I've met new today and those who I've met before in the future, especially the water commissioners. for the city of Torrance. I've seen them on several occasions, and so thank you for being here. And John has been on my inspection trip, and I looked at him and I said, gee, I didn't know you were a mayor. He said, oh, it just happened, right? So it's just a pleasure to be here today. And I want to, one of the things that I'm going to talk about in my remarks is partnerships, right? And so just the fact that we are having this community meeting is so important because it is important that you know about your water. Water is critical. Water is life. And so it's a pleasure that Metropolitan is joining in with Senator Allen and his staff to be a part of this program this morning. I have great words to talk about your legislator this morning, the senator, because I've known him for many years. So I'm going to leave that for the last in terms of how I feel about him, because he really is a great legislator. He really is a great senator, and I've known him for a while. I just want to make some comments about our general manager. When I was sitting there, and in fact, Director Williams next to me and said, gee, he must have all of that information in his head because he never speaks with notes. I don't think I've ever seen Jeff speak with notes. But that just tells you that this is institutional knowledge. He is probably one of the smartest, brightest, and most committed water leaders in the industry, certainly as a general manager. And so, but it just tells you that, water obviously has been around for a long time. Metropolitan has, I think, since 1928, and Jeff has been general manager for about 20 years. And so we're very lucky to have him, and we're very lucky to have him as the general manager for Metropolitan, because Metropolitan is an important agency as it relates to water. In fact, we're the largest supplier of drinking water in the nation. That's our mark. We provide water to, I think, 1 out of every 2 Californians, and I think 1 out of every 17 Americans. Not too far off from those stats. But, you need to think about that, how important the role of Metropolitan is. So, but again, happy to be here with the senator this morning. Thank Charles Gales and your staff and Metropolitan staff, Lana, and everyone for being here. I do want to also start out by saying Director LaFave is on our board, and certainly he has represented the city of Torrance very diligently. He's always at our meetings. He always is thoughtful in his comments. He has great questions, and that's important when you make important decisions on water policy. You have to be engaged. You have to know the subject. You have to have that commitment because they're critical statements and critical decisions that we do make. So you're well represented by Director LaFave. So thank you for what you do, and I appreciate serving with you. Director LaFave and Senator Allen, the communities you serve and the people in this room represent what we strive for in Southern California: economic vitality, a commitment to environmental stewardship, and a high quality of life. Those are very important. High quality of life, economic vitality, and a commitment to environmental stewardship. Those are very important to us. I'm excited to be here today directly engaging with all of you. It is so important that we all work together to find solutions to the challenges we face. And as stated, we have some huge challenges. And Jeff has talked about them, and of course you will hear from the senator later on, because the water policy is a very complex area. Water is a very complex area, and it impacts all of us. All of us, it does. And so we all work together to achieve some solutions to those issues. When it comes to water, I'm proud of the outstanding work that Metropolitan and other agencies, including West Basin District, which I represent, and in the room, I believe someplace is my great general manager from West Basin Municipal Water District, Patrick Shields. So Patrick, raise your hand. And so day in and day out, talented and hardworking men and women, not only at Metropolitan Water District, but also the 26 member agencies we serve. Catherine is in the room. WRD is not a direct member agency, but certainly play a very important role in terms of achieving reliability for our region. So I want to acknowledge that too. Our employees at Metropolitan and throughout the water industry are looking for innovative ways to ensure the region's water supply remains reliable. That is very important, reliability. And they do such a good job. We have about 1,800 people at Metropolitan, and they do an outstanding job. We have, in my member agency, I think we have about 50. But the point here is that all of them are dedicated to making sure that you have a reliable water supply that is safe and with quality. Planning is paramount to achieving that. For decades, Metropolitans looked far into the future to determine what the region's water needs will be and how to address them. And one of the ways that we look at making sure we have water reliability is developing local resources that we can control. And Metropolitan has done a great job through our board by having a program called a Local Resources Program, where we support member agencies developing local resources such as recycle water, capturing stormwater, and using groundwater sensibly, and increasing conservation is paramount. You have done a great job with water conservation. You've gotten that message that you cannot take water for granted, that you have to conserve water. So thank you for doing that. Metropolitan's leaders have always understood the value of working together. The agency was born out of the realization that Southern California had to unite to solve their water problems, and collaboration is really important to me as a chair, and also to many of us in this room recognize that collaboration and partnership is key to coming up with any viable solution to the challenges that we face in the water industry. In 1928, Metropolitan was formed as a voluntary collective of cities to build a lifeline across the desert to carry water from the Colorado River to a fast-growing Southern California. The building of the 242-mile Colorado River Aqueduct is what Metropolitan did in 1928. That's why it was created, to do that. And this was something that no single city could do. So our forefathers and women, I hope, was involved in that decision, had the foresight to realize that that needed to be done. And that's why Metropolitan was created. Since then, Metropolitan has grown into a collective of 26 member agencies. That's the collective cities that are part of the Metropolitan family. And there are 38 board members that represent those 26 member agencies. And the city of Torrance is one of those representatives, and Director LaFave is your representative. And we all are dedicated to the region's water supply reliability, pooling our resources and using economies of scale. Metropolitan and its member agencies have built hundreds of miles of pipelines, reservoirs, and cutting-edge water treatment plants. We're always looking towards the future. We're always looking towards improvement, all with an eye to protecting the environment when we do that, and making sure our drinking water is safe. Very critical. Not only the supply, but it is safe. Through our interdependence, the 26 member agencies, the entire region benefit, regional benefits. That's really a concept that is very important when you look at collaboration, when you look at partnership. We shared this in many of the work Metropolitan is doing to ensure the region's resilience, and that's a key word, resilience, the fact that we are able to adapt to any change. During a meeting earlier this month with Governor Newsom, Jeff and I and some of the other board members met with our governor to talk about not only what we're doing in Metropolitan that's important, but also to talk about resiliency. how important that is. We will continue to meet with the leaders in Sacramento, in Washington, D.C., and here in Southern California to advocate on behalf of those we serve, every single person in this room and the 19 million people that Metropolitan serves. Building a strong connection to our leaders and to each of you is why we are all here today. A connection to Senator Allen and his constituents and the public. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce one of those great leaders, and Senator Ben Allen is really one of those great leaders. Senator Allen grew up in the 26th District. He is a former board member and board president of the Santa Monica Malibu Unified School District, and we have something in common, Senator. I served on the school board in the city of Inglewood for a number of years, and so we understand how important education is to the quality of life and to our communities. And so I have the same passion. We both have the same passion in terms of enlightening our community, whether it's through education or water. And I'm just very happy to know that Senator Allen went on to the state legislature. In 2014, Senator Allen was elected to represent the 26th District, covering the West Side, Hollywood, and coastal South Bay communities of Los Angeles County. In Sacramento, Senator Allen is making his mark, and he truly is making a mark. I visited his office, visited him on several occasions. I've been involved in water for 14 years, and every year that I go to Senator Allen, along with other board members, he's always engaged. He has this way of making sure that he learns everything he can from anybody who walks in his office. He has the maps spread out all over the tables. He has papers every place, and he always asks the important questions. And I love that about you, because how can we make very important decisions, and you've got to ask the key questions, and trust me, Senator Allen does. So he's always engaged in it. Senator Allen is effective, very effective, thoughtful, and a hard-working leader. When I saw him, he looked like a young kid who had just graduated from college many years ago. Now he looks more seasoned because because he really is a hard-working person. I also had the pleasure of accompanying him on I call it issue-related water trips, right? Research trips, and I spent a couple of days with him, and I got to know him really well during that time. But again, he's always seeking information to make sure he makes good decisions, and that's what I continue to love about him. He serves on a number of committees and caucuses, and particularly relevant to today's event. He is the chair of the Senate Environmental Quality Committee and a member of the Senate Committee on Natural Resources and Water, very important committees as it relates to water. And I'm so happy to have him there. We are happy to have him there. So please join me in welcoming my friend, a great legislator who's committed to his constituent to improve the quality of life. And that's a big statement, and I sincerely mean that. And please join me in welcoming Senator Ben Allen, who will provide a legislative update for you today. So, Senator Allen. You're welcome, darling.
Thank you.
You're welcome, sir.
Wow, that was an exceedingly kind introduction. I appreciate you, Gloria, a great deal. It's true, we've had a chance to hang out in a lot of different iterations, both when we were both in the education world, and then I think one of our earliest really substantial conversations when we were sitting outside some club, I think, waiting for an endorsement meeting. And we were very nervous, and we ended up having a wonderful conversation. And it was that day that I realized what a thoughtful, kind, passionate person Gloria Gray is, and we're fortunate to have you as chair here. You've got such a great team. I mean, just all the folks you've been able to hear from already, Russell and Harold and Jeff, and all of the people who work to make our water system work better. And so it's great here to be among so many friends. I've seen friends from elected officials from our local governments, and we did miss a local elected official with Steve Zuckerman over here from Rolling Hills Estates, and he's a wonderful city council member. But I get the chance to do a lot of things in this job. It's a fascinating job. It's incredibly diverse. One of the things that makes the job actually difficult in some respects is that, I got to work on water issues. I've also got to work on transportation, finance, and insurance, and banking reform, and public safety concerns, our school system. What are we going to do about judiciary issues? I mean, the list goes on and on and on, and it's part of what makes the job really fun, actually, is if you're an intellectually curious person, run for office, because you get to work on try to solving every issue under the sun. So I want to thank Jeff for that very informative presentation on our water supply. It's a complicated landscape that we're facing right now, and it's only going to get more pressing over time. And you're absolutely right that climate change has made all these issues more difficult. But some of these issues are just kind of the bread and butter issues of environmental challenge that don't even have anything to do with or at least are peripherally having to do with climate change. Things like toxins, plastics pollution. It's interesting. A lot of people, people think of environmentalism as something that is a nice thing to do, right? We're going to preserve open space somewhere. We're going to, maybe create some national parks so that when I go out to Utah, I can go hiking, and that's a nice thing to do. And we're going to save animals who live far, far away. But the fact is that, and I've become so acutely aware of this now that I'm in this job, protecting our environment is really protecting ourselves and our own individual public health. I mean, the things that we ingest into our bodies, air, water, and our food, the things that keep us alive, that keep us safe, that keep us healthy, are so impacted by the environmental decisions that we make. And if we're not doing right by our environment, if we're letting more and more toxins into our air or into our water stream, all of that stuff ends up in our bodies. And it's pretty shocking when you look at the data, how much we are now ingesting into our bodies that we did not before. If you look at the amount of plastic material that are in each and every one of our bodies now, the chemicals that are in our bodies now, and this is not something that we can, that we can hide under, put your head in the sand and think that you're going to go buy a bunch of bottled water, which, by the way, ends up having a lot of the same toxins that may exist in other parts of our water stream. This is something we have to address. You can't escape this. And so it's one of the reasons why it's so important that we be always thinking about ways to protect our environment, making it a little cleaner. I have a little son now, and I've been thinking about it all the more. He's 16 months old, and he's this wonderful little bundle of energy, and he's got such a great little personality, and he's incredibly, he's a total delight. And I just makes me wonder, what kind of world are we giving to this little kid and to his generation? What sort of products are we already giving him that might make him more or less safe, more or less healthy? And what sort of world are we going to be giving to him and to his generation? So it's something I think quite a bit about. It's something, of course, the issue of water and water reliability and water safety is something that has been at the heart of California's history from the very beginning. Anybody, if you, I commend you, many of you have probably already read Cadillac Desert, which is just such a fascinating book about all the water wars throughout the West. And they say that, whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting over. And it really is true. The water has become, and if you talk to a lot of futurists and people who study international affairs as well, so many foreign conflicts throughout Africa now and all over the world come down to water rights and water supply and water accessibility, because it is such an immensely important resource. And we all know that it's in finite supply, and people are always going to fight over it. So it's a geopolitical challenge as well. So we have a lot of problems and challenges to face, and the committees that were mentioned are committees that focus on trying to create a better system for everybody. Our Natural Resources and Water Committee and our Environmental Quality Committees. These are sort of the two kind of primary environmental policy committees in the state Senate. And we've been doing a lot of work on trying to ensure that there's a balance between competing resources. How do we preserve resources, maintain public lands, clean our environment, while also making sure that we're meeting all of our other big policy goals: housing and health and agriculture, industry, business, etc. And so these are all. This is the kind of the constant challenge of the legislature. Every bill that comes forward, any bill that is substantive on the environmental front, almost always has some sort of pushback. And we talked a little bit about. I was sitting next to John here, and we talked about all of the special interests in Sacramento, who represent all sorts of different groups, and they're always kind of raising concerns about why we can't do this, why we can't do that. And sometimes the concerns are valid. Sometimes, of course, the legislature really needs to look through what the core message is, which is ultimately about trying to protect, a special interest that is not looking out for the broader public interest. And that's kind of a constant struggle and challenge for many of my colleagues, striking that balance properly. We're right now looking a lot at the issue of drinking water contaminants. That's been a huge challenge, and it does butt us up against a lot of powerful industries in agriculture and elsewhere. We certainly anticipate more legislation addressing the Water Board's process for reviewing emerging contaminants, how to set response levels, how to tackle this crisis. Of course, in the Central Valley, there's been a lot of work and a lot of controversy over the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, SGMA, which was spearheaded by our incredible senator who just left the Senate, Fran Pavley, who represented the area just northwest of here. And SGMA, of course, has been an important player in helping to preserve groundwater supplies in the Central Valley that were being so grotesquely overdrawn. But then, of course, a lot of agricultural interests continue to raise concerns about the way that it's written, the way that it's managed, and anyone who's ever driven up the 5 or the 99 can't help but can't help but see a lot of the signs that are put up along the way to criticize the state's water policy. So we also have a big battle right now about voluntary agreements, and you're seeing some interesting cleavages within the Democratic Party over this issue. And just this last year, there was quite a tension between the legislative leadership and the governor over this whole question of water supply and water access in the Central Valley. And then now there's a whole new layer with the president stepping in. He was just in the Central Valley last week in Bakersfield and made a big announcement, and up until then, at least, it seemed as though there was a certain amount of cooperation happening between the Newsom and Trump administrations, and some of the announcements that were made there, caused some more tension in that relationship. That, of course, nothing I have to explain to everyone here. So it's an additional kind of challenge. Now, of course, as some of you know, the voluntary agreements were a solution proposed by the State Water Board staff as an alternative to a regulatory approach to improve the health of Northern California rivers in the Bay Delta. State officials have recently released a framework for a new set of proposed voluntary agreements. And, I think those of us who care about our environment are keenly aware of the need to balance flow operations while protecting our habitats and tidal lands, and meeting our supply demands while also monitoring our endangered species populations. And that's been a real source of tension in the legislature. I will say, the hard work of all of you down here working on trying to create more self-sustainability here in Southern California is not going unnoticed. The work in Santa Monica, for example, the work on trying to increase recycled water use. I just met with some of my friends from the WRD, and I couldn't help but notice their Water Independence Now effort and the extent to which they've now been able to increasingly provide the bulk of water to our communities through recycled water as opposed to imported water, so we can become less and less reliant on the Bay Delta and the Colorado River. And it's part of how we've been able to grow as a community, grow as an area, while also at the same time not overdrawing those resources. And it reminds me a little bit of what we were doing. This is not necessarily an entirely fair comparison, but if you look at what we were able to do with regards to air pollution here in Southern California, there was a time when the average kid in Southern California was growing up with half of the lung capacity of kids growing up in rural parts of the country because of how bad our smog was. And we were able to, through really strong action, take steps to tell the automobile industry that we needed to cut back on smog and cut back on pollution. They, of course, kicked and screamed. But and in the end of the day, we were able to push them, and it actually changed the way that automobiles pollute all over the world. In fact, much for the better. The interesting thing is we now have double the population, and yet we have cleaner air. And it's not that people aren't driving any less. I mean, anyone has to spend any time on the 405 like I do knows that. So but it's an example of government stepping in, working with industry, pushing industry to do the right thing with regards to the environment. And that's something I'm going to talk a little bit about with regards to some of the bills that I'm working on right now. How do we work with our friends in industry who ultimately their responsibility is to their shareholders, our responsibility is to our constituents, and how do we work with them through their constraints, through their logistical constraints and their financial and regulatory and legal constraints to help to do more of the right thing when it comes to producing more environmentally friendly products that will make less of a burden, less of a footprint, less of a burden for my little son's generation. Because right now we're paying the price from previous generations' decisions with regards to pollution. So let me talk a little bit about PFOS, which is something that I know is on many people's minds. In 2016, it was discovered by the Department of Defense that over 16 million Americans have been exposed to a class of toxic chemicals called per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFOS, PFAS. And so, a more recent analysis has found that possibly as many as 110 million people have been impacted by these chemicals. Now, this is a set of chemicals that have historically been used to make commercial and industrial products that resist heat, stains, grease, water, and more. So, you can see why it became such a popularly used chemical. Now, these are man-made chemicals. They do not break down in the environment. They accumulate in the environment. And PFOS has been used in aqueous film-forming foam, so wonderfully alliterative. And it's a product that's used for extinguishing petroleum fires, and it's now been identified as a primary source of drinking water contamination. And all of you who are working in the water space are now worried about this and trying to figure out ways to mitigate. The exposure now is so widespread, by the way, that it's estimated that nearly every person on Earth has PFOS toxins in their blood, even in some of the most remote parts of the world. Now, in addition to polluting water, PFOS in firefighting foam and the coating on the protective gear that firefighters use is a health concern for firefighters due to the long-term occupational exposure to chemicals. As protective gear worn by our firefighters heats up, toxins then seep into their bodies, including into reproductive systems and other sensitive organs. And now cancer is now the leading cause of line-of-duty deaths for our firefighters. They're more likely than other works. In other words, they're more likely to die of cancer than smoke inhalation or of burns or of any other. They have high suicide rates, unfortunately, as well because of trauma, PTSD, and the like. But cancer has now become a silent and deadly killer of our firefighters. And there's no question in the researchers' minds that a lot of this has to do with increased incidence of chemical exposures on the job. And so because of these risks that these chemicals pose to the public's drinking water and the serious risks that they pose to firefighters' health, we're now working on legislation to mitigate these risks. This is SB 1044. It would ban the use of firefighting foam containing PFOS chemicals except in situations where it's required by the Federal Aviation Administration guidelines. We worked really hard. We wanted to introduce this bill a couple of years ago, but our folks in the firefighter community weren't quite there yet. They were concerned that this might impact their ability to effectively fight fires. Now that there are some alternatives on the market, now that the cancer data has become a little bit more clear, the firefighters union and the folks who represent our firefighters are now more enthusiastic, and we're now moving forward with the bill with their support, which is enormously important because they're, of course, at the front line, and they're also the experts on firefighting. So we now feel that we're in a place where this will do right by our firefighters and our environment, while at the same time not impacting our ability to effectively fight the increased wildfires that we see. The bill also requires manufacturers of PFOS-containing firefighting gear to notify anyone purchasing the gear that it contains the PFOS, allowing personnel to make informed choices to limit unnecessary exposure. There are ways to work with PFOS to dramatically reduce your chance of developing some sort of negative repercussion, but people need to know. They need to know that the PFOS is in the material that they're using. another piece of legislation I'm working on right now, it was mentioned before, it's SB 45. It's my bill, it's the Senate's vehicle for a bond that we're looking to put on the ballot in November. Now, as we've been discussing, we've been bombarded with overwhelming natural disasters that really go beyond anything that we saw before. We had a prolonged drought that was followed by flooding, a catastrophic and deadly set of wildfires that were then followed by serious mudslides in many parts of the state. We've seen a rise in average temperatures and more extreme heat days, which are expected to increase in intensity and frequency as time goes along. We're also seeing sea level rise, which is now creating a whole slew of political and very difficult challenges for our cities who are left holding the bag on what happens with all those seaside properties that are now being swept away into the sea in some of our colleague cities. And while my area, our district, this area here has not been as impacted yet, it's a problem that's coming, and it's something that those of us who work in local government are going to have to spend some time thinking about and figuring out how we're going to deal with the incredibly difficult and searing experience of telling constituents that their property is soon going to be taken over by the sea. And we can build seawalls, and we can try to put in more sand, and we can put in more mitigating infrastructure, but fighting the sea is not a winning proposition. And I think one of the things that we're going to have to think about in terms of our scarce local resources is what is it right to our constituents to continue to put all this money into a losing battle? And are there other paths? Are there other ways to do right by our folks who are living on the coastline while also doing right by our constituents who rely on scarce public resources to pay for all the other things that cities pay for, from senior services to transportation to law enforcement and public safety. So, we know that the impacts of climate change are becoming more pronounced. I talked to my colleague who represents San Francisco. Think about the Embarcadero and the amount of wealth and value that is in that little square mile. It's pretty extraordinary, and it's already experiencing flooding on a yearly basis. You think about similar things in Miami. I mean, it's getting a little scary. Especially you think of a country like Bangladesh that's in, one of the most populous nations on earth that is going to be underwater, almost entirely underwater by the end of the century, which is such a wild thing to say. And I think we haven't quite gotten our heads around that. It's hard, I think, for people to really think about what that really looks like and what that will feel like. But it's something we're going to have to start to spend some time trying to figure out. And so, the fact is that we're now talking about, we've been spending a lot of time trying to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. That's great, but I certainly am very supportive of those efforts, and we're certainly hoping that we can stave off the worst effects of climate change. But even if California were to implement the strongest greenhouse gas emission reduction policies in the world, if they're not adopted by the rest of the world, they'll ultimately be a drop in the bucket. And even if we were able to reverse the trend, there's still a set of impacts that we're going to feel just on the natural given the current trends. And so we're now at a place where California is estimated to have about $575 billion worth of property at risk of flooding from sea level rise. An estimated 15% of homes in California are in high risk or extremely high risk fire areas. And of course, we've seen fires that are much more severe than ever before and a much longer fire season than ever before. We talked about our water supplies and how reliant we are on our snowpack. In 6 of the past 7 winters, snowpack in the Sierra has been 60% below average levels, with 2015 recording the lowest snowpack levels in 120 years, surpassing the previous historic low set just a year before. And now we're seeing that, as we mentioned, our snowpack levels are now quite a bit below average this year. And that's a big deal. I mean, that impacts tourism. It impacts, but it only, about $1.3 billion is associated with our snowpack alone in terms of tourism revenue. But it's also, of course, drinking water, the key drinking water source for 60% of the state's residents. And it's a perfect storage system, right? I mean, we're always struggling to come up with ways to store electricity and all sorts of other things. But this is sort of the perfect, Mother Nature's perfect storage system that's frozen as snow and then, of course, melts over the course of the year and provides water supplies throughout our dry summer and fall. And it's worked beautifully. But ultimately, if it's not big enough, if it's not a big enough snowpack, we're going to have problems. So What the state now estimates is we're going to have about a $113 billion cost to the state associated with climate change annually by 2050. And so what we're trying to do with SB 45 is to start putting together some money to help communities start to better prepare for these impacts. And it's a general obligation bond. It looks to fund projects that reduce fire risk and restore already damaged areas, restore and protect impacted wetlands, watersheds, waterways, coastal resources, fish and wildlife populations, reduce climate impacts in local communities and on vulnerable populations, improve the resiliency of the state's water supplies and agricultural lands. And so it'll include things like funding projects to help fire-prone communities to create more defensible space. I know I represent the peninsula, and which has a lot of fire risk down there. So this would be money that would help your local governments. So guys like Steve could help make sure that we assist, upgrading, the firefighting and emergency alert system, equipment, creating more defensible space. Installation of water treatment facilities as well, construction of infrastructure required to attach out-of-compliance water systems with larger in-compliance systems. And it's also looking to protect water supply, sustainable drinking water through stormwater capture and groundwater management as well. The US EPA has recently come out with estimates showing that California is going to need about $20 billion during the next 20 years for infrastructure development and improvements to ensure the delivery of safe drinking water. And I'm glad to hear, I've just heard that they're starting to step up and provide more grants for PFOS mitigation, which I think is going to be enormously important. But in general, there's a lot of infrastructural needs that we're going to have to put some money into. In 2018, the Public Policy Institute of California found that information gaps seriously hindered progress on addressing safe drinking water. And so this bill, SB 45, includes funding for improved data management as well and collection to improve water supply management and the effectiveness of water quality action. Sometimes we lack the information. You talked about Australia. One of the many things that Australia did after the drought was they put in place a really robust data collection system. You could go on, in fact, they really upended their entire water rights law, which was based on British common law. Of course, there's no problem with rain in the UK, but there's a lot of problem with rain in Australia, just like because it's a similar climate to what we have here. But part of that is they basically set aside a certain amount of water per person for everybody, and then they created markets that are traded openly on the as part of almost like a stock market for water supplies. But that, of course, requires a very transparent, accessible data collection system. So anybody could download an app right here in Torrance and find out where all the river and water and reservoir levels are in southeast Australia. And you too can get involved in water speculation down in the land of Oz. So we're going to have to do something on the data management side too. And obviously it's going to be hard for us to totally upend all the water rights issues because we've got a robust agricultural industry that will push back on substantive change in that area. Though Sigma started that process, and I think we're going to have to continue that conversation. They're going to want to make sure that the cities are doing a little bit more to deal with water conservation. And the argument that's always made when we go to the Central Valley is, well, all your constituents have nice pools and they're swimming around while we're actually putting our water toward producing food. So that's what they say. So there we are. So that's another thing we're going to be working on. So we got a Senate vehicle. There's an Assembly vehicle. The governor's come through with his proposal as well. Our vehicle kind of has the most specificity with regards to the kinds of projects that I think are going to be meaningful to the people here. Funding for water treatment services, groundwater recharge projects, diluting contaminants in overdrafted groundwater basins in the state. But I will say the good news is that the governor's proposal really does focus a great deal on water. There's a lot of interest in trying to fund water and water infrastructure and addressing the water infrastructural challenges that we have as a state. So I've got a whole other bill on plastics and packaging and waste management. I know a lot of us here are in local government, and this is something that's starting to really weigh down local government coffers because local government is responsible ultimately for magically disappearing all that waste that we produce. I'm pleased that we were using silverware and plates because even an event like this can just alone by using plasticware, we end up putting a big burden on our cities who then have to figure out a way to collect and then send all this stuff off to the landfill at great cost, given the fact that the Chinese no longer want our trash, they no longer want our recycled material. And so it's a whole other topic that I'm happy to talk about a little bit later. But I do continue to be really grateful to have the opportunity to work with such a great local staff. I want to point out Sam and Alina, who work really hard here in the district to serve our community. Overworked and underpaid, just like so many of you in local government. But it is an honor to get to work closely with you, people like Gloria and others who work so hard to do right by our local communities. We do face enormous challenges, but I do think we also have a lot of resources and we have a lot of will, and there's a lot of political commitment to trying to address these enormous challenges that we face as a community, as a state. And so with that, I very much appreciate your time and attention. I look forward to our panel. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Senator Allen. That was terrific. Jeff, could you join us while we go through the questions and answers? We're coming on the end, and I would of course understand if people leave, but maybe we could ask Senator Allen and Jeff maybe one question apiece, and we'll go on with that. But before we do that, I would like to make a comment about PFOS. What Senator talked about is not something that the water people can do much about, firefighter equipment and so on. But the water in the area is itself contaminated with PFOS, and in Orange County, they have shut down 35 wells, and they expect to have to shut down over 60 wells. Fullerton had to shut down a well. They expect to shut down another 3 wells. But we who live in Torrance and in the West Basin are going to be just fine. There are 3 ways, 3 treatment processes for water that is contaminated by PFOS. One of them is the use of reverse osmosis. Well, it turns out that 90% of our water comes from the Edward C. Little recycling plant that is run by the West Basin, which is run through reverse osmosis process directly. So, and it's used for the injection barriers that keep the ocean from coming into the West Basin. So we're measuring for PFOS. We don't expect it to come even close to a place where we would have to shut down any wells. With that, I'd like to open it for question. Let me begin with a question. Yes?
We have a problem with water, obviously. What have we done towards building desalination plants? With rising water, we would use seawater, which is rising. We could lower it by putting in these plants and providing water to the constituents. I don't think we'd be using up all the seawater, but it would go a great. I know Israel has used desalination plants since 1948. I think something like 89% of their water is desalination water. They used it for farming, they use it for bathing, they use it for drinking. So what have we done regarding desalination?
Happy to start on that. You're right. Israel's using almost all their municipal water now as desal. Saudi Arabia is about 75, 80%. So it's a proven technology that does work. It's extremely expensive. It's about triple the price of other sources of water here in California that Metropolitan sells. It's also has it's incredibly highly energy intensive, and it has its own environmental issues. So what we see in California is probably certain niche areas that don't have access to other sources. San Diego has very little local rainfall and very little local supply. They've built a large desal plant. Santa Barbara, very little local supply, no real groundwater there, so they've built some. Monterey, Salinas, Avalon, and Catalina. So you're seeing spot application of it, and that's probably what you'll see over the next 25 years, given its high price and high energy use. And then we'll see from there if and it may grow in use, but it's going to be topical in certain spots that doesn't have other sources. Not really. The price will, it's really based on energy, so it'll still be probably triple other supplies.
We've got another question. Okay. Oh, yes. Thank you for taking my question. As a grandson of a small farmer, my grandparents came to the United States in 1905, 115 years ago. I'm all in favor of the small farmers. I'm a big fan of farmers. But when it comes to the water supply, as Senator Allen mentioned, the water supply, according to the staff here at the Water Commission, 80% of the water is being used by the farmers altogether, and 20% by the urban users. So even if the urban users conserve 1,000%, there's still going to be 80% being used by the. But of course, one half of those farmers, or one quarter, are small farmers. So they're doing a great job of sustainable farming. What about the three quarters of the senior water rights? How will they be able to help contribute to the present problem with water?
The big guys?
Do you want me to speak? Yeah.
We can go for it first. And
What you're seeing is farming. One of their biggest inputs is, of course, water. 80%, yes, of the developed water is used by farmers. And they have very extensive systems now to save money where they can. You're looking at pistachio farmers and almond farmers. California now supplies 90% of the world's almonds, not the nation, the world's. And so these farmers are using incredibly sophisticated techniques to conserve as much as they can. But you're not going to see the actual usage shrink because it goes back into production, and they brought more land into production, and it's a very sophisticated operation. So you're seeing a very efficient production, but you're not seeing the water freed up then for use by the urban, and that's part of the economy. It's a very important economy.
I mean, I'd be interested in getting your thoughts on this. It does seem as though Israel and Australia and others have implemented more aggressive water conservation efforts that have allowed them to grow their crops at lower rates. When we went out to Australia, they were utilizing various techniques with regards to their water tables in their fields, and that hadn't been implemented here in California. And it does seem as though one of the problems that we have is that the water law really doesn't incentivize conservation, because if you don't use the water, you then lose it, and in some respects, the law is set up so as to use your last year's water as a base for the next year, and so you don't want to underutilize it, and so that, which I think is sort of screwed up, if we're trying to figure out a way to use less water. So I'd love to spend some time trying to figure that one out. It's hard. It's a hard issue.
Okay, we've got one question here, one in the back, and I'm going to come back to this last table.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Just a curious question. It was said that, I believe Jeff said this, that you're replacing the concrete with steel liners in the streets.
Yeah.
Okay. Steel rust, and did you mean stainless steel? Because stainless steel also rusts if you get it from China, Korea, or India.
So we used to build everything with steel and iron, and then in the 1970s it seemed a really smart idea to use pre-stressed concrete piping, and so there was a lot of that put into place. Several hundred miles of it was put into place in Southern California. We now have found that the pre-stressed concrete lasts about 40 years, whereas our steel-lined pipes last 75 years or more. And so it saved money in the 70s, but in the long run it actually cost us more. So we're going back through, and we've decided to just redo our entire system by putting in steel liner and all that. It's going to be a 10-year process. It's long.
And they're getting it all from Williams and Sonoma, I think. So it's very expensive stainless steel.
This is fresh water. There's very little rust on it, and so that's why it lasts 75 years or more. But it is an expensive process, and we're doing it. And we have to conserve water at the same time as we do this. So we can only do about 6-8 miles at a stretch over a 2-week period, and that's why it's a lengthy process. And we're tearing up streets in your neighborhoods as we do that. But it is a long-term process.
And it's very expensive.
Hi, I just wanted to know what the state can do or is doing to build more reservoirs, especially right here in the South Bay, because our water pattern does change from year to year. Last year we had so much rain, but we had nowhere to catch the water. So what can we do to build new reservoirs right here in the Southern California and the South Bay community?
So the state has working, what we're probably building our reservoirs more in Northern California, where closer to the rain and snowpack, and then use our existing delivery system to do it. And so they are looking at a couple of sites in Northern California. The state, in their last water bond, there was $3 billion put aside for helping kickstart some of these storage projects. So we're seeing efforts after a long time when California didn't invest. There hasn't been. Metropolitan's built reservoir. We built a very large reservoir in Riverside that came online in 2000. But you haven't seen the state build a reservoir since 1960. So, and we had something like 9 million people in the state there. So now with 40 million people, you're seeing the state realizing it needs to do some investment. And so the recent water bond has some in there.
I'll go for another 5 minutes.
Senator Allen, here's a political question for you.
Yep.
You talked earlier about whiskey and water.
Yep. Which do you prefer?
A little bit of both. Now, there's a lot being talked about right now on the presidential side.
Yeah.
Between the conflict between capitalism and socialism. And it's caused a great deal of national debate about what defines what and what. The Metropolitan Water District is one of the largest civically owned infrastructures in our nation, as we're told today. Now, explain that to some of your Republican constituents here today. What does this mean?
Well, I know what you're trying to say. That there's a great deal of public investment. If you look, everything from the public school system to the post office to our roads to our water infrastructure, these are all, we've socialized the costs. We've come together and created government institutions that help to address these enormous infrastructural challenges. And so I think, I think the point you're trying to make is that it's not a radical idea for us to try to come together and invest collectively in needed infrastructure.
One more question.
Thank you. Any connection between the amount of debris on our state highways, freeways, on-ramps and off-ramps, and possible pollution of our water systems?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting issue. There's the obvious stuff, and then there's the stuff you don't even see. One thing that Councilmember Zuckerman and I have spoken a bit about is the enormous liability that our cities now have because they're responsible for runoff pollution, and they're now on the hook with our water board because of the Federal Clean Water Act for all sorts of mitigation of costs because of all the pollution that's going off into the sea and into our water system from roads. And it's not just the obvious stuff. It's also things like zinc, which is a necessary component of our tires. There's a lot of debris that comes off of our cars just through natural wear and tear that end up contaminating our water supplies. And so this is a big issue you've just raised. And it's actually it forces us to spend some time thinking about all of the materials that go into our vehicles, some of which are actually polluting our water system. And I've gotten into that conversation and gotten smacked around a little bit so far, but I'm pretty committed to it because I know, there's a city in my district, I think it has like a $25 million annual budget and a $300 million liability under the Clean Water Act. So cities are going to get buried under this if we can't get a handle on it.
Okay, I think that that's it for this event. I want to thank Senator Allen for your leadership. It's just terrific. And a special thank you to Chairwoman Gray and Jeff Keitlinger for taking their time to be here in Torrance. And last but not least, to our community leaders, we appreciate your engagement and hope that you will share what you have learned. And before I close, I'm going to do a plug. I want to mention the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers Sustainable Technology event, IEEE SUSTEC 2020, on April 23 to 25th at the Doubletree Hotel in Santa Ana. It's going to be a sustainable forum on April 23rd. The title being The New Norm, Drought and Water Supply Resiliency for California. Diane Gatza from the Water Replenishment District is going to talk about doing desal for brackish water in the West Basin. Chris Repp from the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power is going to do a talk on Mayor Garcetti's plan to recycle every drop of water out of the plant at the airport. And I will talk about the Metropolitan Water District recycle plant in Carson. I look forward to anybody who's interested in water to show up on April 23rd. And with that, that's it. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.